finally time for elementary or Sherlock. Do me a favor, ignore my hair in this video because it's just not doing anything today that I want it to. So, elementary or Sherlock. Every time I've sat down to script this video, I have ended up talking about a million different villains and a million different antagonists. And that's because I realized it is really important whether Moriarty is an antagonist or a villain. Now I know what you're thinking, not that same thing? Not really. So what's an antagonist? An antagonist is basically the antithesis to your protagonist, or someone who is in direct opposition to your protagonist in some way. But Mary, doesn't that mean that every antagonist is a villain? Not necessarily. A villain is always evil. An antagonist doesn't always have to be evil to be directly opposing someone. For example, Irene Adler is an antagonist, not a villain. In the original story, A Scandal in Bohemia, Irene Adler refuses to give the King of Bohemia letters that he sent to her while they were having an affair. I mean, the king is the one who was the sloppy-ass cheating bag of fat dicks. And Irene Adler isn't in the wrong for keeping letters addressed to her. That's kind of the point of letters. As I said in my previous elementary vs Sherlock video, what makes her an antagonist is the way she directly opposes Holmes's views on women. None of the actions she takes, including defending her own property from being stolen by Holmes, are actually evil. Irene Adler was just a woman who was minding her own business existing, and then the King of Bohemia decided to come along and blame her for the size of his tiny penis. In the original Holmes stories, however, James Moriarty is definitely a villain. But the man had hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind. A criminal strain ran in his blood which, instead of being modified, was increased and rendered infinitely more dangerous by his extraordinary mental powers. This is a direct quote from The Final Problem, and in the quote Holmes more or less confirms that Moriarty's motivations come from a genuine desire to incite evil into the world, which makes him a villain. Because in order to graduate from just plain old antagonist to villain, one must simply want to be evil. Let me put it another way. I disagree when characters like Loki in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Bane from the Dark Knight trilogy are classified as villains. Because if we had been following the aforementioned perspectives of these characters rather than their relative protagonists, they could just as easily slide into the role of the hero of the story. And this is a key difference between an antagonist and a villain. Can you imagine Kilgrave as the hero of Jessica Jones? Can you imagine the Joker as an alternative hero to Batman? Can you really imagine James Moriarty being the hero in Sherlock Holmes' story? Probably not. And that's because antagonists are characterized by a far more complex moral background and intricate story than villains are. This gives antagonists the capacity for growth and change, and to even inspire this growth and change in others. When a writer really wants to sell you a truly evil character, I guarantee you won't really know anything about that villain other than what they're doing in the present plot line to aggravate the protagonist. Antagonists and villains alike share a very similar purpose. They and their actions are the physical representation of the protagonist's conflict within their own story. So, for example, in the first Thor film, Thor is struggling with the burden of being worthy of being his father's son and heir. Meanwhile, Loki, our antagonist, is grappling with the realization that he is not in fact his father's biological son. Both struggles actually boil down to the same question: is everything that I have ever been told a lie? Thor, our protagonist, refuses to accept this and does everything he possibly can to prove himself worthy of being his father's son. While Loki, our antagonist, embraces the fact that he isn't his father's son to the point where he makes decisions purely based on things his father would or would not do. Loki's recklessness and all-out desire to just destroy everything his father built because he believes it is built on a lie manifests what Thor's fear he would become if he gave in to that doubt. Funny enough, the brothers reach the same conclusion. They are responsible for their identity, not their father. It is only the way that they set out to come to this realization that differs them. because antagonists and protagonists actually typically have the same goal in mind, albeit in slightly more problematic ways. Villains, on the other hand, are pretty straightforward. They just want to foster evil. Their intention mostly revolves around 1, inciting evil, and 2, stopping anyone that gets in the way. This being said, there are many antagonists, like Loki, who can switch between villain and antagonist like he does in the Avengers, but a true villain will not be able to switch sides. If you want an example of the ultimate idea of a villain, in my opinion, just look at the Joker, or Heath Ledger's version of the Joker in The Dark Knight. Not only does he acknowledge that he wants to turn Gotham into a cesspool of corruption and fear, which is a direct opposition to Batman's desire to inspire strength, affirmative action, and that individuals are at their core good, the Joker points out that Batman's direct opposition to the Joker's ideology is the very reason Batman will never truly defeat the Joker. Batman will never kill the Joker because he believes that somewhere deep down the Joker is inherently good, just like he believes the same of all the people of Gotham. Literally, the reason that Batman can't kill the Joker or defeat him is because he sees the Joker as an antagonist when he is a villain. The greater purpose of an antagonist and a villain aren't so different. It is just to represent direct opposition and or conflict experienced by the protagonist. Whether the character is in direct opposition with a conflict shared by both the protagonist and the antagonist, or whether the antagonist is in direct conflict with the foundational beliefs of the protagonist and the world that they live in, defines whether they are an antagonist or a villain. The important thing to note in all of this, though, is villains and antagonists are both defined by the protagonist's own moral values, how the protagonist sees the world and chooses to operate within it. Professor James Moriarty is defined as a villain because he chooses to weaponize his own intelligence to incite evil into the world. He directly opposes Holmes's beliefs that intelligence should be used to help people and fight injustice. Moriarty and Holmes are both two ideologies in direct opposition to each other. So I know Holmes comes back from the dead like 10 years after The Final Problem was published, but for the purpose of this conversation, I'm really only going to talk about The Final Problem and things before it, because The Final Problem was Conan Doyle's intended end for the character, and anything written after that, I kind of feel like it's sort of like Indiana Jones. It's something that exists, unfortunately, because people didn't know how to quit when they were ahead. Okay, so now I have kind of solidified Professor Moriarty's role as a villain in Holmes mythology. Let's talk about BBC Sherlock's Jim Moriarty. On face value, Jim Moriarty's profile looks almost identical to the original version of his character. He is a brilliant genius that uses said genius to incite evil and injustice in the world. My problem with BBC Jim Moriarty is that he is a poorly crafted villain who is attempting to also be an antagonist. And this is why the title for this video is that it matters whether or not Moriarty is an antagonist or a villain. He is trying to be an antagonist to a protagonist with inconsistent moral values, which ultimately means that Jim Moriarty fails at either being a villain or an antagonist. BBC Moriarty is what you get when you don't give the protagonist, and by extension their world, any concrete moral values or ideology to directly oppose. As I said before, Holmes and the Professor in the original stories were in direct opposition with each other because they literally directly opposed each other's ideologies. Holmes believed in the idea that intelligence was something that could be used to help people, and Moriarty literally the opposite of that. Holmes hates injustice and Moriarty loves it. This direct opposition is not allowed to exist in the BBC version of either of these characters. Even though Moriarty still enjoys inciting injustice into the world, BBC Sherlock is characterized by his personal desire to understand injustice, but not for the sake of acquiring justice. BBC Sherlock, the character, not the show in general, but also the show in general, is apathetic to the nature of the world in which he lives, and says on multiple occasions that the lives of the ordinary people around him, as in the people that literally give him money to eat and sleep and such, bore him. Think of all the times that Sherlock in BBC Sherlock is excited by murder and horrible things rather than disgusted. Sherlock even acknowledges that his character has no concrete ethical or moral concerns over people, making him an inadequate hero. This is him literally saying that he cares more about the abstract perception of his own intelligence than he does about using it to solve injustice. This is further characterized by his refusal to literally not help people who aren't interesting enough to him. This is treated as a comedic trope in all 4 seasons of the show. In the Reichenbach Fall, the combination of Sherlock's passionate fascination with crime and disgusting injustices in the world, in combination with his general demeanour of assholery, make him such a convincing Moriarty that Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat don't even tell us how they eventually disproved that he was Moriarty. There's nothing wrong with a villain sharing a few traits with the protagonist, but you're going to have a real hard time convincing your audience to root for the hero if the hero's moral and ethical values are almost indiscernible from your enemy. Also, Sherlock's fascination with Moriarty's methods make him more of a janitor than they do a hero. Rather than dealing with Moriarty because that would mean actually getting rid of him, Sherlock opts to clean up after him, whether it's solving the puzzles that Moriarty gives him because he hasn't got anything better to do, dismantling a criminal network instead of, oh I don't know, maybe actually making sure the head of the network is dead. Sherlock allows his decisions to almost be completely defined by the consequences of Moriarty's actions, rather than a genuine idea of morality or wanting to rid the world of as much horribleness as he possibly can. It's not that difficult to argue that everything Sherlock does in BBC Sherlock is in an attempt to just defy Moriarty. I could really easily say that the only reason that Sherlock rescues Irene Adler in BBC Sherlock is so that he can just give Moriarty the bird, like, hey, you didn't kill this one, lol. He didn't even get interested in stopping her from all her phone shit until Irene Adler mentioned Moriarty after all. Which brings me to my next gripe. In BBC Sherlock, Moriarty is always endgame. Always. Doesn't matter what it is. A random kid drowned when Sherlock was a kid? Moriarty was bored. Sherlock goes to the circus? Yeah, Moriarty brought them into town just to mess shit up because, hey, well, something better to do. Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss's determination to making Moriarty the secret center of everything makes him an ungrounded and unbelievable villain, in combination with Sherlock in desire to kill the most interesting thing in his life, means that Gatiss and Moffat literally won't kill Moriarty because they've made him too integral to not only defining Sherlock as a character but also Sherlock's entire world. Killing Moriarty would mean Sherlock would have nothing to do. The strength of your protagonist's resolve is reflected in the strength of your villain's determination to destroy that resolve. If you create a villainous James Moriarty whose apathy matches Sherlock Holmes, then there's no reason for the audience to fear for the two. Jim Moriarty in BBC Sherlock is a poor villain because he's a mouse running on the wheel that is Sherlock Holmes, or you could even say vice versa. Other notable poor BBC Moriarty things include, but are not limited to, queerbaiting! Because who doesn't love seeing their sexuality being vilified like we're living in a 70s Disney animation? Moriarty being portrayed as insane, which vilifies people with mental illness and shows Mephistos' own laziness in refusing to give their villain an actual reason for doing the things that he does. That way people can just say, oh yeah, he's crazy, and without actually questioning his actions, and also means that they can make him do whatever they want, even if it doesn't make sense. Like, oh, I don't know, maybe going and visiting Sherlock's long-forgotten sister just for, you know, the heckers of it, I guess. It's not like mental illness or insanity has been used to excuse the malicious actions of white men for centuries, or that Moffat and Gatiss and Sherlock's refusal to actually punish Moriarty is ultimately an extension of that, and it's not like that this same mentality is still alive and well today. So, Moffat and Gatiss desperately try to paint Moriarty as a villain, by making his actions completely rooted in evil, but also make their protagonist, aka Sherlock, directly parallel him in almost every way, and Moriarty obsess over Sherlock's life. Even giving Moriarty not one, not two, but 3 connections to Sherlock's childhood in Mycroft, in Euros, and of course in Karl Powers. Moriarty even acknowledges that he's always bored, making him and Sherlock's goals almost exactly the same. The point of Jim Moriarty is not necessarily to facilitate or manifest conflict, but rather be someone that we, the audience, can look at and go, oh well, Sherlock must be the good guy because he's not as bad as that guy. And if this is the main function of your antagonist in a story, you need to go and do some serious rewriting of everything. To have a good antagonist, that your protagonist is not necessarily a good dude, but has some concrete ethical and moral beliefs that your antagonist or villain can directly oppose. Because otherwise, you're gonna get the kind of mess that you get when you watch the Reichenbach Fall, an episode that literally means nothing, even though it goes for an hour and a half, because everything in it turns out to be insignificant and or a lie. Right, so let's move on to Elementary. Warning, if you haven't actually watched Elementary and you want to, there are going to be spoilers ahead. So go and watch Elementary and come back. I'll still be here. If you believe that Conan Doyle created Moriarty to be a pure evil villain, you'd be right, and maybe that means you weren't as fussed on Jamie Moriarty. Jamie Moriarty is not a malevolent or insidious villain in the same way that Voldemort is, or Kilgrave, or any of the other villains that I've mentioned in this video. Not all her actions are rooted in a sinister motivation, but that's not to say that she isn't frightening either. The key difference between Jamie and other versions of Professor Moriarty is that Jamie is 1, multi-dimensional, and 2, she changes, and both these factors make her an antagonist, not a villain. Jamie fell in love with Sherlock when she was assuming the alias of Irene Adler. The only difference between Irene and Jamie is that Irene is a more idealistic, non-violent version of Jamie that exists within her. At the end of season 1, Jamie reveals to Sherlock that she faked her own death as Irene to prove that Sherlock was weak. When Sherlock spiraled into addiction, she believed the game was up and that she'd won until she heard of his miraculous recovery in New York City. I fully intend to do a separate video on the way addiction is portrayed in BBC Sherlock and Elementary. For now, I'll just say I adore the way it is portrayed in Elementary, because neither addiction nor recovery is treated as something evil or uncool, but an ongoing process that's part of being human. In the season 1 finale, Jamie threatens Sherlock, saying that she will break him again and piece him back together into something she'll like instead of killing him. But when he relapses and overdoses, Jamie comes rushing to see if he's okay, proving that the woman that Sherlock fell in love with and that fell in love with Sherlock must be a part of who Jamie is, even if it's not the whole. He proves that relapsing doesn't make him weak, and that his recovery isn't something that Jamie can destroy. The fact that the overdose was faked at Joan's suggestion is a testament to the fact that Sherlock has grown beyond a point where his addiction is something that Jamie has any influence over. This is a huge moment in the series, because much of season 1 is centered on Sherlock desperately trying to distance himself from the previous version of himself who succumbed to addiction. Faking an overdose to capture Moriarty, Sherlock is showing that his past is not a weakness, but a part of himself that he must acknowledge if he's ever going to move forward. But Sherlock isn't the only person that gets a bit of growth in this relationship. In season 2, we learn that Jamie and Sherlock have been writing each other letters since she was incarcerated at the end of series 1. Jamie wants to help Sherlock with the case of a missing girl. Later, we learn that Jamie is the biological mother of the missing girl, and the main reason she tries to escape prison is so that she can ensure the safety of her kidnapped daughter. Talking to her after she escapes, Sherlock observes that she didn't actually kill her prison security guard, and that the only casualties in her mission to ensure her daughter's safety were the men that kidnapped her. Moriarty admits that Sherlock's constant contact with her and his recovery and growth has made her self-reflective on her own destructive behaviours. She asks if learning to care for how other people see you is what made Sherlock into one of them. Sherlock's acknowledgement of this change in her nature and Jamie's questioning of the process of his own change tells us that deep down she desires to be different, if not better. Her love and respect for Sherlock is something she wants to understand, even though it is a direct contradiction to what she believes she is. In later series, we even find out that Jamie has been protecting Sherlock and Joan from afar. What makes Jamie's characterization as an antagonist so successful is that she carries out actions that may have a positive outcome for certain people, with a selfish intention that balances out her antagonistic nature. Jamie Moriarty's is a complete subversion of Professor Moriarty's original purpose. Professor Moriarty was Conan Doyle's way of ending Sherlock. He'd had enough of writing and just wanted to kill him off. But Jamie Moriarty in Elementary is Sherlock's beginning. His addiction caused by her loss as Irene Adler is what causes Sherlock's relocation to New York, eventually becoming a better person and the character we know and love now. Jamie is still a more evil version of Sherlock's intellect, but she's not just there to show how not evil Sherlock is. The relationship may be antagonistic by nature, but it is the constant challenge of the other that pushes both characters to grow and, more importantly, reflect on that growth. Unlike BBC Sherlock, Elementary plots don't need to revolve around Moriarty being evil, because for Elementary's Sherlock Holmes, evil is not what he's afraid of. Sherlock's fear is devolving and becoming the person he was when he was an addict. Jamie represents the ever-present danger and temptation of relapsing into this person if Sherlock stops fighting to grow past the previous version of himself that she represents. And for Jamie, Sherlock represents the cost of carelessness that underestimating the empathy of people and herself will be if she does not learn to see people as people rather than games to win. They are each other's greatest weakness, which forces them to strive to be the strongest versions of themselves whenever they cross paths. Jamie Moriarty is really a further than far cry from Conan Doyle's original intention, and I think that that's okay. To change Moriarty from something that was Sherlock's end to Sherlock's beginning and middle, without allowing the story to be consumed by him, like Sherlock's world revolving around Moriarty and BBC Sherlock, or making Moriarty less impactful as an antagonist is no mean feat. It is so much easier just to make the character a malevolent, godlike figure of evil, responsible for everything bad in the world. But as BBC Sherlock has shown, if you make your enemy undefeatable, then the act or attempt of victory becomes meaningless, as does the characters themselves. If your antagonist is just evil, and then your protagonist and anyone else can really only be not evil, because there's nothing else for them to be. Making Moriarty an antagonist rather than a villain allows for dynamic conflict that doesn't stagnate, and therefore gives the opportunity for the audience to get to know the characters from different points of view, and for the characters to attempt to better themselves in order to defeat each other. Everyone likes a villain. They're fun and consistent and usually guarantee you a happy ending. But if you want your audience to love your bad guy, make them an antagonist. Make them a character that grows with your protagonist, because audiences can only ever care about people that change. New video next week on 8 characters who I was obviously gay for and didn't realize because I thought I was straight. See you guys next time.